Do arc flash and shock PPE requirements give you a migraine? If so, you're in the right place. Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Kapkin, editor of Electrical Business Magazine, and welcome to the webinar, Arc Flash and Shock PPE 101, which focuses on getting your arc flash and shock personal protective equipment right the first time. I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Hugh Hoagland and Mike Doherty, who will help us make sense of it all. Hugh is among the world's foremost experts on electrical arc testing and safety. He has conducted over 100,000 arc tests and participated in over 165 incident investigations. Mike, EB Mag's Electrical Safety 360 columnist, is a longtime electrical safety professional and chair of CSA Z462 Workplace Electrical Safety and a consultant and trainer for eHazard in Canada. Feel free to reach out to them after the presentation by visiting ehazard.com. That's e-hazard.com. Now there will be time after the presentation for Q&A. Just type your questions into the questions panel in your webinar interface. Now, please welcome Hugh Hoagland and Mike Doherty. Hugh, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. We're going to talk today kind of an arc flash and shock PPE 101. Mike's going to hit hazard assessment as we get a little bit further in, but I'm going to talk to you about some specific things that we've seen, going to use some accident lessons, and going to use some of the testing information that we've gained over the last 22 years doing arc tests and looking at lots of different accident investigations as some key things that you want to implement at your site, which will be the most productive in saving lives and also make wearing the arc flash PPE a lot easier for your workers. This is really important. We don't sell arc flash PPE, we only do training, and my company Arcware does most of the arc flash testing in the world, but we focus on trying to help people understand the standards and also understand a practical application of the standards. That's what really matters out in the field is, will my people do it every day? And some of these lessons will help you do that. So we've learned a lot about arc flash lessons from accident investigations, and there are several different standards, US and Canada. We have Z462 and 70E, which cover the industrial electrical safety. In US, we have an OSHA overriding standard that covers our electric utilities, 1910-269. A lot of Canadian utilities use that, and some US utilities may be on, and they use that for a strong standard across the board. And then there's National Electric Safety Code, and there's also the CAN ULS 801 that are for arc flash and electrical safety for electric utilities. Now, each of these standards have a little different ways of doing things, and so I'll just kind of cover one of the quick things is, what level of clothing do I need? Well, each of the standards allow 4, 8, and 40 are three very critical energy levels of protection that are across the board, and we'll talk about kind of how to apply that in the end. And then in face shields, your key levels will probably be 8 and 40. Although there are some 12s and 20s out there. So there's lots of different things out there. The most important thing on arc flash gear is something that people will wear every single day. We find a lot of companies just provide a kit, and people are not wearing arc-rated clothing every day, and they get into a snaggy situation where they didn't expect to have an arc, or they weren't really exposed or thinking they were exposed to an arc, and they get burned because their clothing catches on fire. Clothing ignitions are the #1 killer in arc flash. And it's also the #1 injurer. If you're wearing arc-rated clothing, even if it's a 4-calorie protection and you get in a 40-calorie event, you're most likely to live. If you get in a 40-calorie event in cotton clothing or cotton polyester clothing, you're more than likely to die or be severely, severely injured. And we'll talk about how that happens and why that is, although it may seem counterintuitive. So matching to the hazard is great, but at least getting in the basic gear is really important. So some of the general principles, melting and flammability are the most dangerous. Unfortunately, in Canada, there's a standard that's being used a lot right now. It's called ASTM F2302. 2302 has now been withdrawn from ASTM because it did allow melting materials to be called flame resistant. These materials are quite dangerous. You want to use the standards that are actually cited in 70E or Z462. It excludes acetate, acrylic, nylon, polyester, polyethylene. So any of the materials that melt, you do not want them unless they're arc rated and they're in a blend. So you can blend in some polyester, you can blend in some polyethylene, and there's one very brand new material that's 100% polyester, but it is non-melting polyester, and it's very odd. It's really, really new, but they're quite expensive. So if it's cheap, it's probably not what you want. So beware of those types of things and watch out for melting undergarments. So any material that's arc rated, and here we've got an aramid, polycotton and cotton will always outperform anything that's will not perform well in an arc. Once polycotton or cotton ignite, they continue to burn. They produce a substantial amount of heat, and they will cause probably in the range of 30 to 50% body burn, even if you just ignite a shirt. And the way it kind of works out, you want to get people in things that don't ignite and continue to burn. So any kind of material that's arc rated will not ignite and continue to burn, even if it's not totally protective for the full level that you're exposed to. You'll get burned in a small area at the most, but most people don't get burns at all. So sometimes people say, oh, well, let's put them in a 100 cal suit because that'll be more protective. Well, the problem with that is it sounds smart, but it's got two negatives. Number one, it sends the wrong message. It says, you know, if you only have an 8 cal exposure, you really only need to be in 8 cals. Maybe you go for 10, maybe you go for 12, but you don't go for 100 cals because it gives people a fear, or it makes people think that you're afraid and you really don't understand the hazard. Second thing is, workers don't believe it when they'll cut corners when no one's watching if you put them in something that's really difficult to wear. So a 100 cal flash suit for checking voltage on 240 or 120 is definitely overkill in almost every case. Also, watch out for the little lies of sales and marketing. There are a lot of people that are out there trying to sell the $1,000 flash suit that don't want you to realize that you may only need 20 cals of protection. And better safe than sorry, it's better safe and right. Because if you don't overdress people, they're more likely to wear it all the time or every time they are exposed. If you start overdressing when people aren't watching, and electricians are ones who aren't under frequent or continuous supervision a lot of times, then you could absolutely get somebody who's not wearing it at the right time. Also, don't forget the specialty gear. 1506 covers hairnets, clean room gear, gloves is now a separate standard, and we're actually going to have non-leather protectors in the next few years because we have a standard out for that, and it's in ballot right now at ASTM. Disposable FR, there's actually some disposable flame-resistant arc-rated materials that are out there, rainwear, shoes, PPE of every type is out there now, and it can be evaluated. Now, what if I've got an SCBA or I've got something where I have to wear some kind of a chemical suit? There are arc-rated chemical suits, and you can look at SCBAs and find out some of them they don't have arc ratings, but they may have been tested in the arc, and you can ask the companies, and that MSA is one we have tested, and there's 2 or 3 others that have been tested now. So it's important to make sure these things don't increase the injury, and this is required for the authority having jurisdiction in 70EN Z462. Now, there are several, in Z462 there are several different tables. This is Z462 and also 70E that give you the types of standards to use for your PPE. Don't trust anything that's not listed with the standards that are correct according to the standard. Arc-rated personal gear. Now, Bill and the missing Hardhat, and this is an important one. Bill was working in switchgear. He assumed it was de-energized because on the previous shift it had been de-energized when he'd worked on it. He came back to finish up the job, but somebody had re-energized this quickly to get something up and running and to try to finish the job on the next shift when he was not working. They didn't go in and shut the switch gear up and take all the gear down. They left all the hazard signs, hazard warning signs and stuff up. This was a company that was a chemical company. They had lots and lots of procedures and policies around safety. They were a top-notch chemical company. And the communication and marking policies were different between the couple of groups. And Bill contacted some parts, got hung up, and he was pulled in to the gear by his own muscles, and it burned his head really badly. Now, what could have been done there? Well, making sure that we have clear policies and procedures on re-energizing. The equipment should have been closed up. The equipment should have been basically put back into its normal state and not re-energized and there should have been a shift change job briefing to let people know, here's what's changed since last time you were on. And this company did require a shift change job briefing, but it didn't actually happen. And so should Bill have been wearing a flame-resistant uniform? He was wearing flame-resistant uniform because it was a petrochemical plant, but inside the buildings he wasn't required to wear a hard hat. The hard hat would have saved his life from being, or his head from being burned so badly, and but he was hung up, so he wasn't wearing the rubber insulating gloves. So there are lots of things that go wrong, but making sure you have as many rules that are reasonable in place is critical for getting protected. And in many cases, people wear an arc flash hood, but they could wear a balaclava goggle. In some situations, that might be the most protective way to do it, because then you can continue to have that shock protection. If you have an overhead shock hazard, you should wear the hard hat on the outside of the fabric. Now, some of the newer arc flash hoods actually don't have any fabric on the top, but most of the older ones do. And that's something you can look into depending on the hazard you're in. You may not want one of these hoods that actually covers the hard hat, because the hard hat is shock protection, but that fabric is not going to be shock protective, and especially if it's damp or wet, it could actually arc around or go around the fabric and shock you. Hard hats and safety glasses have been arc tested. They're not arc rated, they're not required to be, and most of them have not been arc rated. They may not provide all the protection you would possibly need, but they're not going to ignite, melt easily, and catch on fire. Every brand that I've ever put in the arc is good up to around 40, 50 cals before they start to melt catastrophically. So it's really important to realize you've got to wear your hard hats and safety glasses. They really, really do save so much of your body, specifically if the parts are covered. We had a Canadian tornado incident several years ago. It was an F1 tornado, cut off the power in a refinery. Journeyman and new hire was troubleshooting. They walked over a metal walkway. Both of them were carrying some toolboxes. The journeyman was in front and didn't touch the metal, stepped up and stepped off the other side. The new hire kind of came up behind him, and he stepped on the ground to the first step of the metal, and boom, he went down. He was dead, but he was shaking, and the guy came back around across when he heard him fall and scream, he went back across, and he saw he was shaking on the ground. He didn't touch him, but they found out there was 1,000 volts difference between the ground and that piece of steel that he had stepped up onto, which was actually a walkway that went over top of a pipeline in that plant. What had happened was they found out later that the power line had gone down after the tornado at some other point in the plant, and it was actually energizing all of the steel in that area. So it was energized at 1,000 volts to ground. And so it was a step potential, but why didn't the journeyman die? Well, the journeyman was wearing the required EH-rated shoes. It wasn't even DI shoes. It was EH-rated shoes with a rated sole, and the new employee, that new hire, had not received those shoes yet. So just little things like that can make a difference in protecting workers. EH-rated shoes are definitely a lower level protection, but they are protection. They're called secondary protection in OSHA. They're called secondary protection in CSA 462 and 70E, but they're critical. Every electrician should be wearing an EH-rated shoe and put on a DI-rated overshoe if they absolutely need that. And there are certain situations where the DI shoes are better or would be needed because they're actually rated all the way up the boot to 1 inch from the top, whereas an EH shoe's only rated on the sole, but they are rated at 18,000 volts and they're tested, but they're tested on the soles only. They are considered low voltage shoes, EH is. DI is considered a medium voltage shoe. They're tested at 20,000, but every single boot is tested just like a rubber glove, but they're never retested, so they still should be considered secondary protection. There's a plant electrician that was repairing a linkage of a motor control center and to drop load and de-energize. Now, this is we actually have this out as a video, and it's a free video on our YouTube channel and also on our website, ehazard.com or e-hazard.com. We have both those now. So it's out there. It's free. It's called Brian's Story. And the rule was that they would always drop load before they switched an upstream breaker to cut off the motor control center so they could work on a motor control center dead. Well, one of the disconnects at the MCC had a broken linkage, and there was a discussion on the spot to just fix that linkage. There were no insulated tools on site, but the linkage is not energized. So the guy said, oh, he just borrowed a screwdriver from the mechanic. He put in, slipped it in there. The screwdriver slipped as he was trying to repair the linkage, and he got arc burns to his hand and his forearm and his face. Now, what are the lessons there? The lessons are never skip the safety rules. When you're supposed to be using insulated tools, use insulated tools. Once you're inside that restricted approach boundary, or really the limited approach boundary for insulated tools, all the tools should be insulated, rubber gloves should be worn, because you've now crossed the restricted approach boundary. So if there's anything in there you could inadvertently touch, according to the standard, you have to be protected from that. So this would have been a simple fix, but breaking that rule makes a big difference. Now, gloves are currently not required to be arc rated, but many companies are starting to arc rate their leather protectors, and some are even arc rating their rubber insulating gloves, or have tested them for an arc rating. But rubber insulating gloves can ignite, and at some point they will not have protection. So you want to make sure you wear your leather protectors if you're above the ignition level of your rubber insulating glove. The black gloves are the hardest to ignite, but some ignite as high as 100 calories and some ignite as low as 20 calories, and they look exactly the same. So be very careful about wearing rubber gloves without leather protectors or arc-rated protectors, either one. The arc-rated protectors are soon to be on the market. Leather gloves provide a very good protection value, as you can see here, and they are fantastic to protect the rubber insulating glove from igniting. Now, in New Zealand, we had an accident where a guy got his hands burned, but he got his hands burned because he was wearing non-FR cut-resistant gloves. There are arc-rated cut-resistant gloves out there. This guy got no burns except on his hands because the gloves caught on fire on the back of his hands. You can see they didn't catch on fire where the coating was. The coating was actually somewhat flame-resistant, but the back of the hands both got burned, and fairly severely in this case. So there are arc-rated gloves meeting this ASTM standard or using this ASTM standard. It's just a test standard. So if I want shock and arc, I'm going to have to wear a rubber insulating glove. A coated glove will not be shock protection. It's not rated for shock protection, and it won't be shock protection. Cut-resistant gloves may look pretty good. This one does have Kevlar in the back, so that's very protective from flame, but the actual coating is not flame resistant on this one, and I've actually ignited that glove. And not that it's a bad glove, it's made for cut. Use it for cut. Don't try to use it for arc flash just because the back says it's Kevlar. There are arc-rated gloves that look just about like this, but they actually are flame resistant and will have a protective value, and they'll be rated and usually labeled with a protective value. This is a cut-resistant glove, the last one here, that also is arc-rated and cut-rated, and you could put a rubber glove underneath this and it would be shock. But by itself, it can't protect you from shock. There is a proposed non-leather protector standard for gloves, and that standard is actually in ballot right now at ASTM, and it may very well become something that would be useful to give better cut resistance from leather gloves, because they could be non-leather, or they could have a cut-resistant insert, and that's going to make it much more protective. There's a factory policy change in this particular company. This is another incident. Worker was doing voltage testing on a plant 480 volt control center. They'd always worn level 2 because the old 70E standard had tables that said when you have low risk, there's somebody who's in the background making some noise. I don't want to put that too much on the recording. So if you can be quiet, or if they can mute that extra phone, I'm not sure who that is, but let's try to do that. Worker wears HRC2, but they were supposed to be in 4 because the policy changed when the standard was upgraded in 2015, but their training didn't get rolled out very quickly. The guy was in a motor control center. It had not been calculated. They were using the tables. They had done a poor job of their hazard assessment. They just said, if it's in the tables, we just use the tables, but they hadn't really upgraded that system yet. They now have arc flash studies. The person died in a level 2 clothing because his cotton t-shirt caught on fire. The cotton t-shirt caught on fire, burned off of the guy. He got severe burns from the t-shirt burning and also from the initial arc blast. When they went back and did calculations, it was over 70 calories in that motor control center. He was just doing voltage testing. That's not supposed to be anything we worry about, but it actually arced because of a slip, and that kind of thing happens. So it's really important that when you have policy changes or you see a hole in your program, you go back and you fix that quickly and communicate it thoroughly to all the workers. Underwear. What does underwear do? Can it be a problem in electric arc? It really can be, especially upper torso or melting underwear. Melting underwear will melt onto the body. This is a cotton brief. There's absolutely no melting or dripping or anything from that. It can ignite at very high levels, but it would take a lot to get through an arc-rated blue jean to get down to your cotton underwear. But if you look at upper torso, you're typically going to have more energy on the upper torso, depending on the incident, but most of our incidents, there's more energy on the upper torso, and a lot of people are wearing the melting, very, very slick underwear. It wicks moisture. A lot of it's polyester or polyethylene. If it's not arc-rated, don't wear the underwear unless it's 100% natural fibers. The little bit of elastic around the waist or a little bit of elastic in a garment, the standard does allow, but you're not allowed to wear melting undergarments. Cotton, wool, silk are non-melting. They're the safest. Wool and silk would be the two safest, though, because cotton can't ignite. The other two will put themselves out, but the most usable is arc-rated undergarments, especially if you're doing overhead line work or anything of very high voltage, because you can get a tracking arc. Burning bra. We've actually had 2 melting bras underneath flame-resistant arc-rated shirts, 2 workers pulling meters in 1 month. Very rare, actually, since then, but there are arc-rated bras out there for female workers. So something to think about. They don't melt. They will not continue to burn. The one on the left is an arc-rated bra. The one on the right is not. This Wisconsin Food Act accident kind of illustrates something I think people should think through. One is these guys are not qualified to work on high voltage equipment. They're in there. There's a supervisor, there's an electronics tech, and there's an electrician. The electrician's here, supervisor's here. The electronics tech is actually bent down replacing a motor that helps to actuate the spring to rack in the breaker. And it was broken, and they were doing that. As it came out, this guy's on fire. If you ever watch this video, look closely. This guy's whole coverall was polycotton. It's on fire. The supervisor is not badly burned. He has first and second degree burns on his face, maybe a little bit of a burn in his hand. The other guy was in front of him. This is the guy who was in front of him. The other guy that was standing up beside him is actually off the camera right now, and he has a hard hat that's melting onto his head. The polyester hairnet that this guy's wearing actually sticks to his head and causes the hard hat suspension to stick to his head. So this guy got some head burns, but mostly these are body burns. These guys never worked again except for the supervisor, and the supervisor quit the job after about 2 weeks, and there was even an investigation to possibly put criminal charges against him. So realize that it's really important that you protect your workers, but it's also important as a supervisor you don't cause them to do things they're uncomfortable doing, and that's kind of what happened in this case. Hairnets and beard nets, there's a Nomex hairnet here on the left. The polyester hairnets are on the right, and it melts and drips, and that's why the standard requires that if you're wearing hairnets and beard nets exposed to arc, you should be using one that's actually arc rated. High-vis vests. Again, we have a high-vis vest that was burning. Those say they're flame resistant. ASTM F2302, never use anything that's been produced up until this point using ASTM F23 alone, 2302 alone. That standard actually just recently with our work at Arcwear has been removed from ASTM. It will actually be withdrawn any day now, and it may come back, but if it comes back, it will not allow these kind of melting things. This melting vest here, past 2302, they can say it's flame resistant, but it doesn't meet any flame resistant test except 2 small scale tests that aren't predictive of burns. And this material is a rainwear type material, and it burns like crazy in an arc flash or a flash fire. So I encourage you to use 1891 or 1506. Those are the only 2 acceptable standards in US, and IEC has a couple of standards. Those are all listed in the ZED 462 standard or the NFPA 70E standard. Use the right standards. Feel free to contact us. We'll help you find the right standards, but we don't sell PPE or anything. Line worker was burned by melting fall protection. Polyester fall protection meeting the ANSI standard, but didn't meet 887, the F887 standard, actually melted onto workers and burned them through their FR clothing. Now, they didn't fall because they weren't hanging by the fall protection, but it's really important that you use the proper fall protection. Fall protection needs to be arc tested, not just ANSI fall protection. ASTM F887 is a correct standard. Rainwear can melt. If they claim it's FR, it might use 2302, it might use a small-scale test method. If it's not 1891 with an arc rating, don't purchase it. Do not purchase ASTM F2302 as a standalone standard for flame resistance in any material. A lot, especially up in the oil patch, there's a lot of winter wear from big name brand companies that claim to be FR. They have F2302 right in them. They're polyester batting. They're a rainwear that's been FR treated on the outside, and they will go up like a Roman candle in a flash fire or an arc flash, and they should never be worn by a worker and thinking they're flame resistant. If they don't meet the arc standard, they will catch on fire at some level of arc, and they'll continue to burn and kill somebody. So these melting rainwear materials, these actually were from Canadian companies that we pulled out just to show you examples. And PVC polyester, there's not any PVC polyester out there that I know of that is really arc rated. They have to have PVC on Kevlar Nomex or PVC on FR cotton. There are some things out there. They're a little more money, but they will not catastrophically fail and kill somebody. So beware of these 2302 garments. That standard, as I said, has now been withdrawn. Everything should be pulled off the market or no longer using that in their labeling. Very common in Canada, though, just as a warning. Arc-rated materials, your winter wear needs to be arc-rated. OSHA requires it to be FR. FR to OSHA is non-melting FR. It really means it's arc-rated, but the winter wear doesn't have to be matched to the hazard. As long as it's a non-melting 1506 compliant garment, it has to be it can be your only protection if you wish, but it doesn't have to be matched to the hazard as long as your undergarments and it's non-melting. But if you watch this one, this is a non-FR jacket on the right-hand side that will continue to burn, and it will be catastrophic to the worker, whereas an arc-rated material will always at least provide some protection. But typically, most people will use that as part of their protective ensemble. Arc flash protection principles. The outer layers need to be arc-rated. The underlayers need to be arc-rated or non-melting. You don't have to have the outer layer at 20 cals. You can use 2 layers. If they're arc tested together, you can use those to develop that protection. If you go to arcwear.com, we have a whole list of dual layer, 2-layer systems that we give you free data on. We don't sell any data on that site. It's all free. Those are tests that utilities have done and release that information to other companies to be used. Just do due diligence to make sure you actually have the matching layers, but that due diligence information is out there when there's 2 brands. If you mix the same brand, typically they'll have a lot of data for you that you can use to build a protective system. But you have to just make sure that it covers all the body, fits comfortably, don't get it too tight because it's a little more protective. It's a little bit looser. And then tuck, button, and roll. Tuck the shirt in, or energy can get up underneath it. Button up the sleeves, button up the top button if you can, and roll the sleeves down and make sure they're buttoned up so you get full protection. Maintain it according to the manufacturer's instructions, no bleach, no fabric softeners, and inspect for tears and frays. Really important that you make sure you're protected. Get an arc rating. Don't use these melting FR materials. They melt onto your body. Make sure you're protected. This guy here, his gloves protecting, they had to cut them off because they shrunk up a little bit. The leather shrinks, but he was totally protected except on his face because he didn't wear the PPE. This guy wore the PPE, the arc flash PPE, face, hands, everything. Vitor walked away with a complaint that the clothing might be too hot and cause heat stress. He was in his first arc 2 months after they put the program in place, and he walked away. Now, I'm not going to go into any more details because I want Mike to cover you on the PPE. I'm going to give you a couple more highlights. Arc blast blankets are now becoming more used. They have failure points. They have details that can protect. In this case here, we use this blanket, and after the blanket, the one on the right, there was no blanket intact. The other one, the blanket was intact, and big difference in body burn. If you can cover up the arc flash hazard of energized parts that can't be de-energized while you're working in a motor control center, while you're working in a type of equipment or working in underground networks, you can actually have huge amounts of protection from these blankets. Always wear your arc flash suit when you're racking breakers that are energized. This one was a 40 cal suit, probably got around 150 cals at the face, and the guy walked away with a few first and second degree burns on the face, was back to work in less than 2 weeks, and was in the hospital just a few days. PPE is the last line of defense, but you want to always make sure that you've done a proper risk assessment. You've looked at all the PPE. I'm going to turn it over to Mike now. You've looked at all the PPE, and you're making sure you understand how protective your garments can be, but I really recommend stay away from just throwing a kit at people and saying use it when you want it, because they will not be wearing it at the times they always need it. And you just wasted $1,000 on a kit that's out in the truck and nobody's actually wearing it when they need it. Put them in regular ARC-rated daily wear and then provide the suits as they're needed. It'll save a lot more lives that way, and that's the important way to do it. Mike?
Hugh, that was a really good explanation, in regards to personal protective equipment. And the one thing that people need to do at the end of the day is they need to get out and they need to do the work. And you had a great segue for the portion that I want to touch on just a little bit today, which is risk assessment procedure. You had mentioned, potentially having an 8-calorie hazard as done in incident energy analysis, and then having people either in 40 cal suits or even a 100 cal suit. And to your point, workers know they're being overprotected, and they know that the people who are asking them to do that haven't done the work. So recently, I get asked all the time for a number of years in regards to, what are some of the solutions for any electrical question, any job plan. Over and over again, I always go back to risk assessment procedure. We embedded the risk assessment procedure in CSA Z462 in the 2015 version, and what we did is we benchmarked CSA Z1002, which has a very long title. I just call it the Risk Assessment Standard of Canada. And if you look in clause 4.1.5.7 on page 19, you will see the risk assessment procedure, the 3 steps that we selected from benchmarking CSA Z1002. If you look in the preamble, the scope section of CSA Z1002, one of the reasons they came up with the standard was to come up with common language for job planning. Contractors, electrical contractors in particular, go to many different places, as would be obvious for different jobs. Sometimes they have to use a JHA, a JSA, SWP, so many different types of descriptions of planning safe electrical work. The really good part of CSA Z1002 is that they now have common language, which we have embedded in CSA Z462. And in fact, it was public input that we suggested to our colleagues in NFPA 70E, and I think it's really the way to go. There is not one single bit of electrical work that cannot be properly planned using the risk assessment procedure. And today I want to roll in where the PPE fits in to the risk assessment procedure and would answer the questions of those that would wear too much PPE, not enough PPE, trying to get to the right portion of a job plan for electrical work. The risk assessment procedure output, well, the output is really the question, and I ask people all the time, what are you trying to accomplish with your job plan? And it's truly a very important question, which we'll touch on today in this little segment. 3 steps, and they come from Z462, or from Z1002. Again, we embedded them in Z462. The first step is to identify the hazards, and of course, they would be electrical hazards. There are many different kinds of hazards, but you ask electricians, you ask power linemen all the time, what are the hazards, the electrical hazards? And almost always they'll give you a voltage. It's 600 volts, it's 4160, 13.8, it's 22 kV, 14.4. They give you a voltage and then they're done. In my view, that is not good enough. There are 3 different touch potentials: low, medium, high voltage touch potentials, typically with the hands, not always. Step potentials, you had a great example of one a few minutes ago after the tornado, the F1 tornado. A step potential in a plant, you usually consider that to be knocking down a distribution pole with a vehicle on the way home is a classic way of having it done. Certainly induced potentials from high voltage, very high voltage power lines can induce all kinds of toxic electrical energy into many different workplace materials that can cause enough energy to electrocute, and in flashover in very high voltages again can flash over. So that's the way I like to describe some of the touch potentials, shock potentials. You have got to break it down a little bit. It will change the way you plan, and it will certainly change the way you plan the plan you have in place for your personal protective equipment. The arc flash piece, radiative and convective heat, 2 different kinds of heat, dB to ears. The personal protective equipment you've got to be wearing hearing protection when there's an arc flash, arc blast hazard. It's very common to see people who are trying to put on a 40-calorie ensemble, for example, and you look, they're not wearing any hearing protection. They really need to break that down a little bit. There could be shrapnel if there's enough blast pressure based on short circuit current. Superheated noxious copper vapor as another example. There can be pressure, molten copper. Starting to think about identifying the electrical hazards in this sense is step one from Z1002 and is now certainly in CSA Z462 when we benchmarked it. Is there enough information just identifying hazards to select your PPE? I would suggest no, not yet. It really needs to go to step two. Step two in Z462 is the assessment of risks, and this is where your tradespeople, supervisors and managers can have a very good discussion. If they have identified the shock and the arc flash hazards based on the equipment itself, potential incident energy analysis study, or the PPE category method from CSA Z462 or 70E, then you come up with a number. Let's just say the voltage 600 volts, 7 calories per centimeter squared. That would be, it could be the identified hazard for that equipment. Then it's really important to assess those risks. What's the age of the equipment? Is it really old? If it's been in place for 32 years, that could have some impact to the risk-based questions. Who's the manufacturer? Was it a very, very robust, strong manufacturer, or was it the cheapest piece of equipment that could be put in with all the attendant issues that could be in place, the risk questions? What kind of shape is it in? Has it got a lot of dirt? Has it got a lot of the environment questions? A lot of dirt and dust, high voltage tracking. We don't, the operating history, the maintenance history, very, very important. And in fact, the maintenance history, if you look at Annex B in CSA Z462, gives you some good guidance, and certainly the guideline, CSA Z463 in Canada, which is the maintenance guideline, or NFPA 70B in the US. The configuration of the power system. Have you got a tie breaker that's closed? How's the equipment being used? And if it has not been maintained, if it's not in good shape, those questions, regardless of the direct contact shock issues or what a label and an incident energy analysis number comes up with, 7 calories per centimeter squared, answering these sets of questions, which is step two in a risk assessment, has major impact in regards to the personal protective equipment that you're going to select, and then certainly the job procedure and everything else. But that's, so are you ready to select your personal protective equipment after going through the assessment of risks? I would suggest there's one more step in the risk assessment procedure, and that would be the implementation of risk control methods. That is the classic hierarchy of methods, and you can tell from the effectiveness rating as elimination by design. We did the EB Magazine webinar back in September, and it was risk assessment in the design phase. If you can design out the electrical hazards by a robust and a strong design, it is by far and away the most effective method to keep people from getting hurt. You can substitute different work methods, do all kinds of things that can also be very, very effective. Engineering controls, maintenance switches, remote racking devices. There's all kinds of things you can do that can make a huge difference in regards to the identified hazard and the assessment of risks. Certainly the warnings are very, very important as well. People need to know. Administrative controls is training, knowledge, and you can see that has its intended problems with effectiveness. And then, of course, personal protective equipment is considered to be the least effective in the hierarchy of methods, but this is where it all comes into play. The identification of hazards, shock, and arc flash numbers. You must have that risk assessment questions. Some of your people that have been in place for 15, 20 years, they know the value of the equipment. They know if it's good, if it's bad, if it's been maintained. All those things need to go into the equation for risk assessment procedure, and we will get to the output of risk assessment procedure very shortly. So that to me is kind of the way you get to pulling your personal protective equipment to do a real job, and it will get you in the ballpark of not overprotecting or underprotecting. So just to sum up a little bit then, CSA Z1002, the risk assessment procedure, was benchmarked for CSA Z462. We did not want to reinvent the wheel, and we used those technical experts on risk. If you look in Z462 or an NFPA 70E, what you're going to find is a shock risk assessment procedure, which is based on the 3 steps. You're also going to find basically 2 levels of arc flash risk assessment procedure. One of the arc flash risk assessment procedures is to use the PPE category method, the classic the tables in Z462 if you are within the correct parameters. The other one is the incident energy analysis risk assessment procedure. There is not one single job done in the electrical trades that cannot be comprehensively handled by using one of these risk assessment procedures if used correctly. So the shock risk assessment procedure I just threw up in the top, it's just a very small screenshot from CSA Z462, page 35, clause 4.3.4.1. A shock risk assessment shall determine the voltage to which the personnel will be exposed. If it was a 600 volt motor control center starter bucket, typically there obviously would be 600 volt direct contact touch potentials, and typically there will be a 600 to 120 volt transformer in there for the control voltage. So there would be 2 shock potentials in a 600 volt motor control starter bucket. The boundary requirements, the limited and restricted shock protection boundaries will typically be on the labels. It will tell you with unqualified, qualified people when they get in a restricted zone using insulated tools, as was mentioned by you, and some of the procedures around that. And then there it is in regards to the topic of the day. It also will help you select the PPE necessary to minimize the possibility of electric shock to personnel. And it works very well, but that is the correct procedure to do shock risk assessment. And quickly, there's a little bit more too, but if you look at clause 4.3.5.1 on page 37 of CSA Z462, it says the arc flash risk assessment shall be performed. It'll determine if an arc flash hazard exists. It's either yes or no. If a arc flash hazard does exist, the risk assessment shall determine the appropriate safety-related work practices. Those work practices can and will and must be changed by the assessment of risk, depending on the condition of the equipment, the maintenance, and all those pieces we went through in the overview of step 2. The arc flash boundary, of course, the onset of a second-degree burn at 1.2 calories per centimeter squared. And there it is again, topic of the day. What's the PPE that the personnel within the arc flash boundary shall use? And that's what you'll get in the arc flash risk assessment procedure, be it the PPE category method or the incident energy analysis method. So I've been asking a lot recently when I'm out doing my consulting training, speaking, what is the output of a risk assessment procedure? One of the terms used by a lot of people is acceptable risk. Well, I've got the big X around acceptable risk. If you look it up in the dictionary, acceptable risk is defined as, it refers to the level of human and property loss that can be tolerated by an individual, household, group, organization, community, region, state, or nation. For instance, the risk of flooding can be accepted once every 500 years, but it is not unacceptable in every 10 years. That is a huge problem, describing it as acceptable risk. It's acceptable risk to me implies somebody's opinion, somebody's thought process, not a lot of science, not a lot of thought. In fact, comprehensive job planning has not gone into the job plan if somebody considers it to be acceptable risk. Well, what's the answer then? I would suggest strongly that the answer is considered to be residual risk. Residual risk is a risk remaining after a hierarchy of controls has been implemented. And in fact, that is exactly the risk assessment procedure as embedded in CSA Z462, which was benchmarked from CSA Z1002. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see, right, if you can see that going around, the definition in CSA Z1002, the 2012 version, is in clause 7.1 on page 6. That is the output of a risk assessment procedure by professional tradespeople, professional supervisors, professional managers who are executing comprehensive, safe electrical work. The 3 steps then, the risk assessment out procedure. So if you should be able to go to your people and say, what are the 3 steps? The 3 steps are identify the hazards, assess the risks, implement a hierarchy of methods. And in fact, it goes well beyond electrical. You should be able to ask your mechanics, people working with chemical hazards, people working at heights. That is the beauty of the risk assessment procedure, the output from CSA Z1002. All 3 of those things need to happen for any job. And what you'll find is, even in Canada, CAN-ULC S-801, the 2014 version, in clause 4.4.4.1.5, on page 26, under the section Safe Work Planning, also mentions what we term as residual risk. And residual risk is the risk remaining after a hierarchy of controls has been implemented, and again, CSA Z1002, clause 7.1. So that CSA Z1002 residual risk is the output of comprehensive job planning by professionals, identify the hazards, assess the risks, implement the hierarchy of methods, and it's common language based on standards, not on opinions. Acceptable risk, in my view, is an opinion, and it's not really good safe work planning. It's not that hard, it's not that complicated, and it's very, very important, and it is one of the major ways to select your personal protective equipment that is fair and effective for all concerned. So could you consider at your company, could you design a new quality pre-job briefing tailboard concept? What are your documents right now? Are they aligned with the common language of CSA Z462, 70E, CSA Z1002? Getting common language will get rid of all the JSAs, JHAs, all the confusion. We need more clarity in our electrical work. The risk assessment procedure, do you know what the 3 steps are? The beauty of it is it can be used for any hazard in any workplace, and it simplifies for everyone concerned. And could you brainstorm some of the potential opportunities for improvement using those concepts to select your personal protective equipment and to make for a safer electrical workplace? Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back to Anthony, and I think he may have some questions for us.
Excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your expertise today. Now, actually, I do have a couple questions here, and of course, to our listening audience, if you do have any questions, feel free to add them to the conversation. Just use the questions interface there in your control panel. I like, Hugh, earlier you had mentioned the overkill on PPE actually being detrimental. I do like the fact that you mentioned that. Shows workers you don't understand what's going on, and your technicians will cut corners. But I wanted to ask something about that supervisor example that you gave, the one where he did return to work but then left work again shortly after that. There might have been criminal charges as well. So if you're a supervisor and you're in charge of some of these guys and management asks you to do this, get something up and running, you have a bunch of guys who don't understand risk assessment, this, that. What can you do as a supervisor faced with pressures from management and faced with pressures of a workforce who has always done things a certain way, and damn it if they're going to change?
Yeah, that is a great question, and we actually, this type of thing comes up quite a bit. That's one example there where the supervisor had absolutely no training in electrical safety whatsoever. He was a mechanical guy. He had no idea the complexity of this task. In that particular case, they actually opened up the louvers of the 13/8 switchgear to put the motor on, thinking they had to open those louvers as if it was some kind of a cooling mechanism, or I have no idea why they opened them. But more than likely the person dropped a screw or a screwdriver and it bounced into the switchgear, which is what probably caused the arc flash. That supervisor was pushing them to get that job done because they were supposed to be off that day. The plant was on shutdown, and the plant manager made them come in and do it because it was going to save them $1,000 in labor from the company that was actually there on site, who noticed that is not working correctly, and they said, hey, we got the part, it's about $200, but it'll cost you $1,200 to install it. And he said, I'll send my guys over. And so he sent unqualified people to do a job, and that company had had electrical accidents in the previously, not in that particular location, but they didn't communicate that. They had OSHA fines. That's why they got what we call willful OSHA fines. It was $146,000 in fines, but the millions of dollars that they made in their payouts, I'm sure it was a case that settled later because those guys were able to sue their own employer, which is quite unusual in the U.S. Another example is we had a guy who the workers went through the training with our company. Worker died about a month after the training, and the OSHA asked us for our workbook. We sent the workbook, and then they didn't call me back. And so in 3 days, I called the guy back on his cell phone, and he says, "Oh, no. The reason I didn't call you back is because your training covered what he did 3 times, said not to do this." And so he was very clear in the training. What happened was we found out the supervisor didn't take the training because he was too busy. And on night shift, he wanted the plant to be back up, so he had him open a transformer, a medium voltage transformer during a hurricane with wind blowing sideways to prove to him that they couldn't fix it after a lightning strike, and killed the one worker, fell back into the supervisor's arms, and that guy actually had an FBI investigation. He didn't get charged, but he was fired 2 weeks after the accident. So supervisors have a huge responsibility not to override safety rules. Listen to your workers if they tell you, hey, this is not something we should do. Don't ever override them. And then the second thing they have a responsibility to do is to actually know. If you're supervising electrical people, you should be trained like your electrical people are trained, so you understand the safety rules and don't override them.
No, that's definitely good advice. If we can just get more people to follow it. And now, Hugh, you had mentioned talking about qualified workers who might be qualified personnel to do a task or to tackle something. And I put this question out to either of you, whoever wants to pick it up. But how do you define? How do you know who is a qualified worker to do something?
Now that's a Mike. I'll throw you the softball, Mike, and you can take that one.
It's one of my favorite topics, and I did at the IEEE Electrical Safety Workshops 10 years ago in Calgary. I was the chair, and we had over 600 people from around the world, and I did a presentation, a co-present with a man called Ravel Ammerman, who is a PhD electrical engineer from University of Colorado School of Mines. We called it Qualified to be Qualified. And he had a third-year electrical engineering student go out in his backyard with his brothers and put a aluminum ladder into a high voltage power line and just close to the backyard. He wasn't killed, but he burned his feet really badly, big burn marks in the grass. And Ravel and his mentor at the school, PK Sen, were beside themselves. They were so upset that one of their young students got hurt. And their quote was, "How could anybody who knows everything about electricity do that to themselves?" And then they looked at their 4-year course material at the University of Colorado School of Mines, and there was not one single bit of information on electrical safety. So what they did is they found 40 hours at the university, and they added NFPA 70E training, so these young engineers would at least have some sense of what it is. We have the exact same issues in the electrical trades. Almost every one of our young apprentices goes through the design and installation standards of the Canadian Electrical Code. They come out as as apprentices, and you look them in the eye and you say, "What can you tell me about CSA Z462?" They have no information at all, haven't even heard of it. They're coming out ready at some level to work on the equipment, but they're not qualified for the electrical safety portion. And it's very, very clear. The worker training clause in CSA Z462 has about a page-and-a-half preamble in regards to being qualified to perform electrical work. The typical portion says you must be aware knowledge of the design and construction of the equipment, but without question it says you must be able to plan your electrical work, and remarkably enough, in regards to risk assessment procedure, the 3 steps. If you can't perform job planning, identify hazards, assess risks, implement the hierarchy of methods, which includes everything you need to do, then you are not qualified in an electrical sense from the safety portion, and it's very clear in the standards.
Very good. I noticed, gentlemen, that we're approaching our 1 hour mark, so what I will do is wrap it up there. Now, for everyone listening, a recording of this webinar will be available also in a couple weeks. We have a dedicated YouTube channel for webinars, so stay tuned for that information. And if you're visiting ebmag.com/webinars, check out some of the other topics and speakers we've got lined up, and feel free to contact me with any ideas for topics we should be covering. And with that, I'd like to thank again Hugh and Mike for delivering this information. They've got their contact information on the screen, and again, visit ehazard.com to check them out and get in touch with them. Meantime, please enjoy the rest of the day and do stay safe.